G'day ladies and gents, and welcome back to War Thunder. Today I'd like to have a discussion that has been quite a long-standing argument, or at least something that has been constantly brought up throughout the history of War Thunder. Now a lot of the time, especially since the addition of newer and more modern vehicles, a lot of people have advocated for a historical matchmaking, meaning that the tanks that I suppose this means that the tanks that fought each other in real life would fight each other in War Thunder. So, for example, you would have Tiger 1s facing T-34s. You would have Panthers and Tiger 2s facing Shermans. You would have things like T-54s facing the M46 and the T-34-85 facing pretty much everything from late World War II all the way through to the Korean War. Now, there are several reasons why Gaijin hasn't done this, and I'll go through them in a minute. But first, I'd like to take a look at a couple of other things that I see in the idea behind this, because in some cases, this has actually worked quite well. What do I mean by this? If you look at the Normandy event, if you think back to that, the historical matchmaker was actually quite well made. And honestly, I think that this could be a thing that could be implemented for events. And you know what? So far it has to some success. It's actually not bad. You know, you see Sherman Fireflies and regular Shermans facing Panzer IVs, and they make up the majority of the team composition. And if you do well enough in a Panzer IV, you can upgrade, I suppose, when you get knocked out to a Jagdpanther or a Tiger 1 or a Panther. And honestly, I see that as a really interesting way of doing things. If you have a set lineup or a set roster, which is definitely the case for a historical event, then you can really pull this off, and it works quite well. Especially if you manage to get the balance just right with events that were, somewhat well balanced in real life. And that is my first point. I would like to note that in random battles, this kind of can't happen because the way it works is that history isn't really a balanced battlefield. Every nation, every power, every government, I suppose, is trying to get the biggest technological advantage they can over their opponent. That's why we look at North Korea today as a laughingstock, still using MiG-19s and MiG-21s, while we sit here with our brand new F-35s and our F-22 Raptors, FA-18s, etc., etc., etc. The reason why we look at countries like North Korea today as a laughingstock is because they just don't have the technology to keep up with us in a fight. We would simply outclass them. And that is the reality. In World War II, this was also the case, where we were looking at constant back and forth between tanks. Let's take a look at tanks. So at the start of World War II, we have the Panzer II and early Panzer IIIs. And the Panzer IV is, sort of starting to come out into fruition. And everyone else, so let's take the Americans versus the Germans as a prime example. The Germans had the Panzer IV, but they had a howitzer on it. So the American M3 and the Stuart just simply couldn't keep up. So what did the Americans do? They developed the Sherman out of the M3 project. And what that did was that gave the Panzer IVs something tougher to fight. So what did the Germans do? They upgunned the Panzer IV, and then eventually they designed a whole new tank, the Tiger. And then they built up on the Tiger and made the King Tiger and the Jagdtiger, and of course the well-known Maus, which never saw combat, but still. The fact is, might I add, that the M26 Pershing was designed as a competitor to the Panther, or to the Tiger 1. And the T-29 prototype tank was designed as, you guessed it, a counter to the King Tiger. The way it works is, every nation develops something based on the move that the opposing nation has done. So if I go and make myself a tank, my enemies will try and make a tank that's bigger and better. And then once they make that and I realize that I've got to upgrade my guns or make a better tank, then I do that. And this happens constantly throughout history. Not only that, but you also have Lend-Lease programs. And this is something that I'd like to get into a little bit later. But some tanks are often lended to other powers. For example, the M3 Lee was used in the Eastern Front. And the Americans, whilst they absolutely hated the thing and it was bloody useless, the Soviets loved it. And they cherished them. They cherished the Matilda as well. They even upgunned the Matilda. Things like this are, not very easy to look past. And when we look at War Thunder as a matchmaker, we start to see that if I were to put a historical lineup on the cards, I would have things like Shermans facing King Tigers and Jagdtigers, and even though the Shermans in real life seemed to do okay against them, that's because they were heavily outnumbered, they had air superiority, they had several other things going for them. And that simply just doesn't play out well in a video game. Can you imagine being in, for example, the Tiger 2 and being outnumbered 10-1, and then having planes bombard you constantly? In War Thunder, we actually get a little bit of that, but it's nowhere near as heavy. And in fact, I think in the case of the Shermans and the King Tigers, maybe that would work for an event. But in random battles, I would just pick the Germans, because all I would do is I would sit at long range and I would pick them off the same as the Russians. T-34-85 doesn't stand a bloody chance. Can you imagine it? Can you just imagine the carnage? The reason why we have a capabilities-based matchmaker rather than a historical matchmaker is precisely because every nation's vehicle development comes at a different rate. The Japanese weren't actually developing anything serious until 1944, 1945. Can you imagine? There are several accounts of, Ha-Go's, and Chi-Ha, Chi-Hei, all these sort of light Japanese tanks going up against Shermans with 75s. Now, they actually don't see... They see a Sherman. They see one Sherman, and it's the earliest Sherman. And they can just barely penetrate it at short range. That's the Chi-Hei. The Chi-Ha, I believe, doesn't see a Sherman at all. And so, what you have is a matchmaker where the Chi-Hei actually has something that is a little bit more on its level to fight against. If I were playing Japanese tanks and I wanted to grind out to my Type 90, but I had to grind through the Chi-Hei, I just would give up if I had to face a Sherman every single battle, because it would be unfair. I could only penetrate them from the side, they could sit at long range, they have a stabilizer, they can lol pen me, and it's just not fair, it's not fun. I would give up. I honestly would not bother playing the Japanese if that were the case. But what we have is we have a matchmaker that's based on vehicle capability, so the Chi-Hei and the Chi-Ha tend to fight things that are a little bit more early. They fight 1930s tanks like the BT-7. They fight things like the Stuart, which is a very early 1930s to early World War II vehicle. And whilst things like the Stuart and the Sherman... the Stuart was used until about 1944 when it was replaced by the Sherman. But if I were to have a matchmaker based on 1945 or 1944, then nations like the Japanese and several other nations in the game, like the French, would have a massive disadvantage. Maybe they would have the Jumbo and that's it. That would make for a really stale lineup. It would be terrible. And I think on top of that, you have nations that are really advanced with their tank development, like the Germans, to some extent the Russians. The Soviets had the IS-3 ready by 1945. It just couldn't get to the front fast enough to do any damage. It was there in September in 1945, and 2 years later we had the Carnarvon. We had the Centurion Mark III with the 20-pounder. It's pretty hectic tank development, and on top of that, you end up having massive BR gaps. Now, we already have BR gaps, such as the gap between the Tiger 1 and the Panzer IV, the gaps between the Panther II and the Leopard, the gap between the King Tiger and the Mouse. We don't need any more of these BR gaps. I don't think it's reasonable to want a historical matchmaker for this reason. Another thing that I would like to bring up are prototypes. Now, generally, we don't have a set definition for when the matchmaker should be held. Is it going to be done by the date that they were introduced into service? Is it going to be set on particular battles? Does that mean that we have to completely throw out all prototype tanks? And there are some prototype tanks that are more than necessary for this game to even have a proper tech tree. You look at the French. They don't have many serviceable tanks at 6.7. Maybe the Char 25T. The Lorraine 40T was a prototype. I don't believe the AMX M4 went into mass production. Someone correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. There are several AMX 30s, AMX 40s. The French don't have a fully fleshed out tree. What you need to do is you need to add prototypes, and that's just the way it goes. These prototypes never saw combat, and how are we going to define when these tanks were developed? Is it going to be their first test run? Is it going to be the announcement of the project, the development of each blueprint? Is it going to be standardized for each tank? It's something that we just can't do. If tanks like the Sherman have such a long service history that they go all the way with the 75 into the early, I believe, 2000s, serving with the Ugandan military, are we going to classify the Sherman as a tank that went from the 1940s all the way through to 2004 so it can face things like the Type 90 and the M1A1? I don't think that's reasonable. Obviously not. I think you can all agree with me on that. I think things like the ASU 57, which has a 75mm gun that you can see at 4.3 in the T-34s. I don't think that's reasonable to be at any higher than 4.3, because if it was actually at the date that it was in service at, it would be facing T-50. It'd be in the lineup with the T-55. Like, that's too much. PT-76, sure, it has 200mm penning heat, but at the same time, it's extremely slow. It has a long reload. It just does not have the capability to keep up with anything at its battle rating. It's garbage as it is, let alone in a highly tiered game with M60s and the likes of that. It's just not reasonable to put things up that high when their capabilities are really quite low. A lot of nations also develop tanks quite slowly, like the Japanese. If you were to put the Type 74 in its proper Matchmaker, the Type 74 was only retired, I think, something like 10 or 15 years ago. Maybe even less. I can't remember the exact date, but I do remember that it was a recent retirement, meaning the last 2 decades. Now, if that was to be the case, then where would it sit? What Matchmaker would it fit into? Would it get all of its shells? And if it was in a lower Matchmaker, would it get its later shells? So, for example, if there was a shell from 1985 that it fired, if it was in a 1970s Matchmaker, like a 1975 Matchmaker, would it would it be able to use that shell? These are things that are just too complicated to factor in. All of these things just make the whole idea, the whole proposal, extremely overcomplicated. It's much better to put a vehicle up against something that is capable of fighting it and capable of fighting them than to have things done by their matchmaking year. It's not reasonable. There's just no way to define it. There's poor balance all around. And sure, whilst 1 or 2 nations may get an advantage, the other 5 suffer. And that's not reasonable if you want a well-balanced game. So I think Gaijin have done the right thing by giving us a matchmaker based on capabilities rather than a matchmaker based on history. Because, let's face it, history is unbalanced. There's just no way to balance it properly. Each battle was different. Each situation was different. In some cases, the T-34s didn't have radios. So are we going to prevent team chat for T-34 drivers? It then becomes a question of, do we want to make War Thunder a simulator, as in something like, I can't remember the name of the tank game, but it's an extremely simulator type tank game that you literally have so many key bindings to set up that it becomes ridiculous after about 10 minutes of trying to set it up. It's like the DCS of tanks. The same goes for planes, actually. I guess the Israelis used Spitfires into the 50s. So are we going to give them, BF 109 as well. I believe they used to check BF 109. Are we going to make the BF 109 fight into the 50s? I know the Spanish used license-built BF 109s. Are they going to? Is the BF 109 going to fight into the 50s if there was some alternate history thing? I don't think so. I don't think it's reasonable, and it's too small-minded to say, yeah, well, this plane is suffering because the matchmaker's compressed. Then it should be a historical lineup because blah blah blah. I don't think that's reasonable at all. I would much rather the lineup to be based on capability, and then it be decompressed a little bit. And obviously, this is something that we've been calling for a long time from Gaijin, and this is something that we're not really likely to get, as in a decompressed matchmaker. So, for the time being, it's not really ideal to ask for this sort of stuff. Yes, sure, the R3T20 is a 1985 vehicle fighting against 1930s vehicles. But at the same time, the reason why it does so well is not because it was made in 1985, but because it travels at 80 kilometers an hour on roads, has a gun that does 60 millimeters of pen at several hundred rounds per minute, and should not be sitting at battle rating 3.7. It should be sitting at battle rating 5 with the Ostwind. It just is not a vehicle that should be fighting at that tier. That explains it way better than, it's at 1985, so it should be fighting against 1985 vehicles. No. Just no. It doesn't work like that. Because then you have an unbalanced matchmaker. Maybe it's balanced for you at low tier, where you don't have to face something that's broken overpowered, but at the same time, it ruins it for literally everyone else. So I would suggest, if you do want to do something like, or if you want to advocate for something like this, I'd say look at the bigger picture. There's more out there than just a little battle rating that has a post-war tank in it. There's a little bit more. And whilst this is certainly a problem in some cases, for example, you could argue that the FV4202, the Carnarvon, the Centurion Mark III, and the Centurion Mark X are at a little bit of a low battle rating. Some things like that are quite strong. This is more a symptom of a compressed matchmaker. It's not necessarily a symptom of a poorly functioning matchmaker design. It's just the way that it should be, but a little bit squished together. So instead of asking for a historical matchmaker, which I guess if you're looking at events could be done that way, I think it's fine. I think it worked for Normandy, and that's the one that I played and enjoyed. I can see it working for other events. A lot of people enjoy that, so sure, for an event, yes. But for random battles, I think it's better off that we stick to a matchmaker where the vehicle's ability is more the deciding factor than either the year it was designed, the year it was prototyped, the year it was put into service, or the year it was retired. I think this is a better matchmaker, the one that we've got now. It just needs to be decompressed, and that's where the problems are coming from. Anyway, ladies and gents, thank you very much for watching. I hope you understand, and thank you for your patience. Thank you for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you next time.